Hello everyone. Welcome to our YouTube lecture, our video lecture here, number 12. We're in period 7 still. And this one deals with World War I and the New World Order. So let's get right into our key concepts. So we're going to be in 7.3 Roman numeral 2. We're going to be doing A, B, C, D, and E. Hopefully, I know that sounds like a lot, but hopefully this can go fairly quickly. We'll see. So what's going on here? So World War I begins in Europe, obviously. This is mostly a European issue. The United States doesn't get involved until the very end. And we see this here in our concept here, first of all, the overall concept here, 3, Roman numeral 2, World War I and its aftermath, intensified ongoing debates about the nation, and that would be the United States' role in the world. This war begins in June 28, 1914, with the assassination of the Archduke, the heir to the Austrian Empire. And that led to a series of treaties that multiple countries had, that once one went to war, then another one went to war, then another one went to war, then another, you get the point. Initially, as we see here, the United States, remember, George Washington and everything, we're going to continue to pursue neutrality, right? George Washington's farewell address, all the way back to those days. The United States is trying its best to stay neutral in these affairs, especially when it comes to trade. The United States would like to continue to trade, and in the beginning, no one side was necessarily vilified. No one was seen really as an enemy. It was just European issues, and the European powers are fighting over it. But eventually, as the war continues, the United States will start to depart from the U.S. foreign policy of this tradition of non-involvement and eventually get more involved. And we see here, Wilson will give a moralistic reason for this war, a defense of humanitarian democratic principles. This is something we'll talk specifically about in class when we read his war message in class. But there's this slow progression that begins to happen in 1917. The war began in 1914, as you see there. And for the United States, again, they try their best to stay out of it for as long as they can. In January of 1917, they'll hear of the Zimmerman Note, this secret German message that's sent to the German ambassador of Mexico, trying to entice the Mexicans to invade the United States. And of course, this will anger the United States. The British were the ones that intercepted this message and brought it to the United States, which has brought a lot of questions to people to this day. Was this a real message? Did the British make it up? You know, there's very little proof either way. So until we find some definitive proof, we'll say the Zimmerman Note existed. It's really the unlimited submarine warfare that begins to happen here. The Germans, they cannot bring their fleet out to the Atlantic Ocean because the British control the Atlantic Ocean, so they resort to submarine warfare. They're wolf packs, as they call it. And they begin to sink ships throughout the Atlantic. The most famous ship that sunk is the Lusitania, which was a British passenger ship, but it had several Americans on it. They start sinking certain American merchant ships. And this is eventually what angers President Wilson, Congress, people of the United States. They ask for the Germans to stop doing this. Of course, Germany never took America seriously. I don't believe the Germans ever really thought the United States would get involved. But this eventually is what's going to lead the United States into war. It's interesting, 1916 was an election year for Wilson, and he ran on the campaign promise that he kept us out of the war. And I like how that expression kept, past tense, that I've done it so far, but there's really no guarantee I'm going to do it in the future. And just a few months after his reelection, on April 6th, he will go before Congress and ask for a declaration of war. Here again are concepts. Humanitarian democratic principles. Well, he says right there in his speech, to make the world safe for democracy. Establishing a new world order, as it were. Trying to bring the monarchies of Europe to an end, establish democracy throughout Europe Asia, even Africa, if possible, and establish what he feels a world order based on the American idea of democracy. Now, I've mentioned this in class. The United States does not participate hardly at all in this war. They declare war again in April of 1917. They will not start sending troops until 1918, anything of significance, that is. And by then, the war is only a few months until it's over. So our concept bears this out. The American Expeditionary Force, as it was known as, plays a relatively limited role in combat. However, the United States, its entering this war, tips the balance in favor of the Allies. The Germans become very much aware that the United States represents this great threat of simple human bodies. After 4 years of war, millions are dead. And now the United States is entering, and they could bring to bear millions and millions of more bodies to this war that the Germans just can't anymore. The Germans are running out, literally, of living people to fight this war. So that's one of the things that really brought this war to an end. Just the idea that the United States itself was fresh, it had a strong commitment to the war, and it could bring a lot of troops into the war. Before that even happened, again, going back to this idea of a humanitarian, democratic principles, Woodrow Wilson establishes his famous 14 points, 14 basic agenda points to try to bring democracy and peace to the world. Now, I'm only going to speak about the first 5 here because they dealt directly with certain issues in Europe. He wanted to abolish secret treaties, right? This would appeal to a lot of intellectuals and people who believed in free and open communications with their government. Of course, when he went to Europe, he then kind of went into a secret treaty with the French, but, America. Freedom of the seas, right? That every nation had a right to travel the seas. Now, this would particularly appeal to the Germans because they felt the British had controlled too much of the Atlantic and parts of the Pacific and did not always allow for free trade, so this was something for them. Removing of economic barriers. This would be to lower the tariffs worldwide, allow for more economic trade, and thereby building up of economies of all nations. A reduction of arms. This was an idea of limiting weapons. It's one thing to say the amount of manpower that went in there, but the hundreds of thousands of machine guns that were built, the thousands of a new invention known as the tank, the ships, the airplanes, the amount of military weapons that were created at this time period is really astonishing. So he's calling for a reduction or a limit of weapons. Also, if you think about it, this thing too would also appeal to a lot of people of Europe because in order to build all these weapons, a government needed money. Where does the government get its money from? The people. They get it from the people by taxing the people. So by reducing the amount of weapons that you build, you would also lower people's taxes. So this was a good one here that really appealed to a lot of people of Europe. Also the adjustment of colonial claims. Remember we talked about this in class. Europe was carving up the continent of Africa. They were going into parts of Asia. Well, let's start to pull back on some of these colonial claims, perhaps allow for some countries their own freedom. He spoke of independence and some of the other points. The last point was a call for a League of Nations, some sort of international body politic, if you will, where people can go and use diplomacy to talk about their problems and thereby limiting war in the world, maybe eventually even eradicating it altogether. You should know that by the time he got to Europe, his 14 points are not going to sit well with European leaders. They're eventually going to pull this apart on him. And really the only one that ever really gets passed is that last one, the 14th point, of which the United States itself never joins. Oh my goodness. What is going on here? Well, here we are now in Concept C. And it's telling you our U.S. Senate, which is controlled by the Republican Party, will not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, nor will they join the League of Nations. And that is right there in the concepts. You have the Big Four conference takes place after the war. Wilson of the United States, Orlando, who represents Italy, Lloyd George of Britain, and Clemenceau of France. These men are not going to get along. It's not going to be fun for Wilson. He is not used to arguing with people, and there's going to be a lot of arguing taking place, something he's not well suited for. The Treaty of Versailles eventually will be ratified, but it will be a very harsh treaty on the Germans. And most individuals of the time period will tell you that this was terrible because you're basically punishing the Germans so much for everything that you're eventually setting the stage for a second war, which is what the Treaty of Versailles ultimately does. But for Wilson, his ultimate goal was his League of Nations. To get that passed by the European powers, which it does, he brings it back home to America, hoping beyond hope he's going to get the United States to take a large leadership role now in the world, only to be stopped by the Republican leader, Henry Cabot Lodge of the Senate, because there's aspects of this treaty that Congress didn't like. The biggest part is what's known as Article 10, not Article X, that's the Roman numeral 10, Article 10. Very much alarmed the Senate because it took away all war-making powers. In Article 10, it basically says that if one league member is attacked by a non-league member, all the league goes to war automatically. The United States Senate would like to be able to say that they still get to declare war and decide when we will go to war. This took that out of the hands of the United States government, took it out of the hands of all governments. I believe that they were thinking that by doing that, you would limit the risk of war. No one would want to just automatically be drawn into war. But World War I's already proven that happens. So Henry Cabot Lodge came up with his 14 reservations. He tried to compromise with Wilson, but Wilson wouldn't compromise. As I mentioned, and I'll mention again and again, Wilson does not compromise at all on issues. And eventually, he decides to take his message to the entire American nation. He is going to go on a nationwide tour of the country, trying to get support for his League of Nations, for the Treaty of Versailles, and demand that the United States Congress, and especially the Senate, ratify this treaty. But he is very tired. He has been very sick most of his life. What a lot of people don't know, that even very early on in his life, he had already suffered from some minor strokes. The stress of the war, the stress of all the protests, the fighting with the Republicans, too much. Giving a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, September 25th, 1919. He's giving a speech. He begins to slur. He begins to stumble around on stage. And then eventually he collapses. His aides will come and get him off. They'll all say it's exhaustion, it's exhaustion. They'll get him back to the White House where he'll suffer a stroke. And his wife, Edith, will basically do her best to keep this a secret, even from Congress. They'll stage a lot of things to make it look as though he is still in his full capacity. And for the about last 18 months of his presidency, it could be argued that perhaps Edith was running the government, or 8 months. And it was an interesting time period in our history. Wilson had thought about running for a third term in 1920. He actually was preparing to do so. It's just not going to be able to happen for him. And all his grand dreams of a new world order, the League of Nations, bringing democracy, making the world safe for American democracy and democracy in general, all of that will collapse. If you think about it poetically, on that stage in Pueblo, Colorado. And Congress will not ratify the treaty. So the United States never signs a treaty with the Germans. Later on, they'll sign a separate treaty on their own. In fact, now we're going to go into this era after the war where the United States wants to go back to isolationism. They want to do things unilaterally, mean on their own. They don't want to be involved with the League of Nations. They don't want to be involved with other countries unless they themselves come up with some ideas. Peace treaties and things like this, they want to try everything they can to maintain their isolationism. And they actually do a fairly good job in the 1920s. The Washington Naval Conference, for instance, 1921, 1922, sometimes known as the Five Power Treaty. Now President Warren G. Harding. There is a huge issue in the world with the buildup of one of the biggest superweapon of the time, and that is the battleship. And the Japanese are a rising power in the Pacific. Great Britain still has a very large navy, but it's a very old navy, and the United States is now building a very big navy. So it's the first disarmament treaty in the entire history of the world, where these nations, eventually China is going to be involved, Italy and France are also going to be involved. Later on there will be a 9 powers treaty. They'll get other countries involved. And they come up with a limit of tonnage, basically. It's based on a ratio of 553. And what that means is the United States and Great Britain are allowed 525,000 tons in order to build battleships. I believe the average battleship could be no bigger than 35,000 tons. So whatever 35,000 going into 525,000. Japan was allowed to have 315,000 tons to build battleships. And this limit the number of battleships that countries can have. And it was a very peaceful way, in many respects, to settle issues. And the United States did not use the League of Nations. They did this on their own. A few years later, there is runaway German inflation because the Germans, again, under that Treaty of Versailles, one of the things they're forced to do is pay, I believe it's somewhere in the 30 billions of dollars in what's known as war reparations. They have to pay money to the French and to the English, to the Russians, and they just couldn't do it. So they allowed their mark, their German dollar, to just inflate to astronomical levels. I can't even begin to tell you how much inflation explodes in Germany. And the United States sees this as a threat. So they got together with Great Britain, and this Charles Dawes, who is a United States banker, he's not a member of Congress, he's a banker, and another individual, I know his last name is Young, they'll be the spearhead of this. What you wind up doing is you wind up loaning Germany billions of dollars. So the United States will loan Germany billions to build up their economy. But they'll take that money and they'll also start paying off their war reparations to to France and England. France and England owe the United States money. So they'll start paying the United States money. So basically, the United States took its money and gave it around only to eventually get it right back. It's a very strange plan, but it worked again. It was a very peaceful thing. The only reason why it eventually fails is 1929, the stock market crashes and a worldwide Great Depression hits. Other than that, it was a pretty good plan. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, again involving a United States member of Congress, Mr. Kellogg, and the French Foreign Minister, Briand. 62 nations will come together in 1928 and sign a non-aggression pact, basically swearing they'll never fight war again. Problem is, there was no way to actually enforce this. Within a few years, most of those 62 nations were at war. But again, it was the United States' way of trying to take care of peace in the world while still maintaining its isolationism, staying away from the League of Nations and getting involved, with those type of treaties. However, it did allow for the rise of fascism and totalitarian governments. Most notorious, Adolf Hitler in Germany. You've got Stalin in Russia, Benito Mussolini in Italy, and of course this military regime that rises in Japan. The United States understand that this was bad, but again, because of its isolationism, they chose never to take any kind of action against these aggressors until World War II breaks out, and really not until Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, which is something we'll talk more about in the coming weeks when we get to World War II. All right, so that's it. I hope this was okay for everybody. No sound effects. I thought it was a war, and I didn't want to get that clowny with everything. Okay. All right, everybody. Have a good night. Talk to you later. Oh, don't forget, on Edmodo is the YouTube video log to fill out for this. All right. Ciao.